Okay, hey, and welcome to another IC82 video with me, Craig, here in Crew Works, here for another Workshop Wednesday, where today we're going to have a look at whether we can convert a DC 040 shunter into a DCC locomotive. This is something that we've had requests for quite a few times on the channel, particularly since we did attempt it and complete it quite a few years ago. One of my first conversions, where I converted the Caledonian Railway version of this 040 shunter into a DCC locomotive. So if I pull off the body, you can see the chip hiding away inside and everything rewired. So what we're going to try and do this afternoon is repeat that with this locomotive and show you how it's done. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is obviously remove the body from the locomotive, which may sound quite straightforward and simple because these are such simple and cheap models. However, in order to try and get everything into such a compact space, it is a little bit fiddly. So the first thing we need to do is remove this top section. Now the top section is held into place using a couple of plastic lugs on the rear here. And then there are two more under here that you can't actually get to because of the cylinders. So all I'm going to do is use a flathead screwdriver to carefully pry the lug away while pulling with my finger on the other side to try and pull the body away. And on the other side. Okay, and away it comes. With the rear detached, I can then lever it up and give it a slight wiggle, and I pull at the front, and away comes the top. With the top section removed, we then need to remove this sort of metal valance section, which is made out of metal to give the model a little bit more weight and a little bit more traction. Now that's held on, again with a few little plastic lugs, which you should just be able to see sticking up at the bottom there, just overhanging and clipping onto the metal bracket. So again, we just need to prise those back a little bit while pulling away from the metal. A little bit on each side, a bit at a time, and eventually that will come away. With that removed, we're then down now to the motor section at the bottom. The motor itself is held in place with a small screw on the bottom. So with a crosshead screwdriver, I can remove that screw. And then there's also a little metal clip. So loops around on this side, goes over the top of the front half of the motor and clips it into place, and then loops around on the other side there. So if I unlatch that from the plastic clips, I can then wiggle that out of place as well. And so now that's detached and the motor is loose, and I should be able, with a little bit of a wiggle, to pull that free. When we then examine the way that the motor is connected inside, it's quite a simplistic electrical affair, because the motor has a contact pad on that side and a contact pad on that side, which then make direct contact when the motor is in position with these two metal plates here and here. Those plates are connected directly to the pickup section that runs down the inside here of the chassis and pops out through some holes to make contact with the insides of the wheels. So the electricity is flowing directly up from the wheel, through this metal strip, up to the side of the motor and straight into the metal contact pad. Now if we're to DCC it, we need to interrupt that, because the power needs to come from these pickups, go off to the DCC chip, then come back from the chip into these two contacts. So we're going to need to do a few little modifications in order to try and insulate the two from each other, stop a direct flow of electricity and wire them up to the chip. The other thing we need to think about is removing these capacitors on the top of the motor. So Hornby have always put into their motors some capacitors that act as an interference suppressant to stop interference with TV and signals and radio signals around and about. So we need to remove those because they have no effect with the DCC chip and can actually interfere with its operation. So we're going to unsolder the capacitors here and here, and unsolder this connection wire here to completely remove the motor, and then we'll have a look at how we insulate these connecting strips. Okay, try to unsolder the connection on the top of the motor, and it won't actually unsolder, it won't melt, but it is only the connection of the capacitor to the outer casing of the motor to provide that interference suppressant. So all we're going to do is snip it off instead, using some wire cutters, and disconnect it that way. That'll do. Okay, it's taken a little bit of a fiddle to try and get some of those wires out, but we've now managed to desolder the connections from the two contact pads on the front of the motor and from the pickup connections on the inside. So if we take a closer look now at those contact strips, you can see how after coming in from the wheel section and running along the inside of the chassis, this strip comes up and bends up and under here, and it's that part of the strip that then makes contact with the pad at the front of the motor. So what I'm going to do is cut away this top section, cut away the bit that comes up and makes contact, but just leaving enough of this metal pad underneath for me to solder the connection to the DCC chip. That should hopefully then prevent any connection between the motor and the pickups and prevent a short circuit. So I'm just going to use our Juron track cutters to reach in and snip off that top section there, and then again on the other side, just going to reach in and snip off. That's now left me two contact pads to be able to solder some wires to. To make life a little bit easier, so that I'm not trying to fiddle directly in the middle of the chassis with the chip, I'm going to solder to it some extension wire. So this is just some very fine DCC level wire, very, very thin, but enough to be able to conduct the electricity needed, and means it can get it into very small places. So I'm going to solder a small strip of this to the contact pad on the left and another piece to the contact pad on the right, so that I've then got something that I can lead off to the chip and wire up more easily out of the way. Okay, so I've now managed to solder two bits of connecting wire to the pickup strips on either side of the locomotive. Unfortunately, I have made a slight error. After looking up and making sure that I was getting the colours the right way round, so that red went to the right rail and black went to the left rail, which matches up to the connections on the DCC chip. I've then had the locomotive the wrong way round the whole time while soldering, and I've put them back to front. So I've actually got the black wire connected to the right rail and the red wire connected to the left rail. So I will have to remember when I come to wire it to the chip to actually wire them the other way around, so that red will go to black and black will go to red. On the motor side, I now need to attach some wires to the little contact pads at the bottom, again, so I can then take them off to the chip and wire them up a little bit more safely out of the way. And if I quickly bring up the diagram for the DCC chip, we can see that the orange wire should be on motor right and the grey wire should be motor left. So I'm going to use hopefully the right wires this time in order to match up to either side of the contacts, and again I'm going to solder them on. So now that I've connected the orange and grey wire to motor left and motor right on the front of the motor there, I'm going to put it back into its little metal harness, like so. And then I put it back into the chassis, making sure that the cog at the front that drives the wheels obviously lines up with the R.G.E screw at the front of the motor. The other thing I need to be careful of when I slip this back in is that this metal bracket fits in between the contacts and doesn't pinch or move those out of alignment, but it should all slot in quite nicely. A little bit of a push. That's all back in place. So I've now got my 4 wires leading off from the motor assembly that I can now attach up to my DCC chip, and making sure of course that I remember to cross over the black and the red because I put those on the wrong way around. It's just a case of directly soldering each of those coloured wires to its matching colour wire on the chip. So here we've got a standard basic Hornby decoder with the normal 8-pin harness on the top. Because obviously we don't have an actual 8-pin socket, all I'm going to do is cut these off a little bit shorter. I don't want to leave too much slack with this one because obviously we haven't got an awful lot of space inside the body of the locomotive, so I'm just going to cut it off around about there. And remove the plug completely. So with the plug disconnected, I can then spread out all of the wires carefully, and obviously you can see there are the other coloured wires there for all the other functions, so I can get the purple and the dark blue, the turquoise and the white and the yellow out of the way and bundle those up to one side. And I can afford to cut those off a little bit shorter still, as we're not going to be using any of those functions in this particular model, because there isn't really any space to start adding lights and things like that to it. I've then got my orange, red, black and grey to match up to the wires that I put onto the locomotive. So all I'm going to do now is strip off these ends, solder them together and make some direct connections. Okay, so when I'm soldering these connections, I'm also using a little bit of heat shrink tubing, which you can then place over the connection once it's been soldered into place, and by applying a little bit of heat from the soldering iron, gently up and down, not really touching it completely, just barely brushing the surface in order to heat it. It then shrinks the tube into place around the connection, meaning that it's fully insulated and nice and secure. So I'm just going to do that to the other 3 wires and get this chip connected. And so there we have it. The chip has been soldered to the motor by connecting up those wires. As I've said several times, but just to reiterate, the only reason that I've got a red to black and black to red is because I made a mistake when wiring up down to the pickups at the bottom. But other than that, it's all connected up. Just to kind of show you an alternative, in case you haven't got some heat shrink tubing, it is possible to insulate those soldering connections just with a little bit of insulating tape that you can pick up from a DIY store. Just a little thin strip wrapped around and stuck together is just as good. As long as it insulates the whole connection, then you're good to go. So the next step now, before I start putting everything back together, is to check that she actually works. So I need to wire up the rolling road and plug in a DCC controller and see what happens. We have motion. Okay, with her all tested and we know that she's functioning, it's time to put her back together. So the first step is to put back the metal valance that adds the weight to the bottom. So carefully get the chip through there, and then make sure those metal clips fit under there, and she should all slide back together. With a bit of a push, those plastic lugs will connect back together, and then we need to fit the plastic top. Now we need to find somewhere to fix the chip, and although the locomotive is very small, we do get the benefit of this small recess just above the Archimedes screw coming from the motor. And inside the actual body there's plenty of space in the roof there. So I'm going to use a sticky pad inside the roof, make sure that's pressed down into the contours there, and then the chip itself going to fit that way up to the sticky pad there, so that she can now fit back on over the top, push down the front, and then at the back we've got those 2 plastic lugs that I disconnected in the first place, so just a bit of a push and they'll snap back into place. And that is a DCC'd 040.